Our kind of first speaker will be Peter Clewes. He's the managing partner and design director at Architects Alliance. Over 4 decades of practice, Peter has created a body of work that has been shaped by clarity and functionality of modernism, and a deep commitment to urbanism and city building. Peter's expressed his design philosophy over a broad range of award-winning academic, cultural, and residential projects, including market and affordable housing for private and public sector developers. Peter has served for 5 years on the Waterfront Toronto Design Review panel and speaks for professionals, academics, and to civic groups across Canada and the US on topics related to design, density, and urban renewal. So without further ado, Peter.
Okay, all right, thank you. So what I'm going to try and do here is do an abridged version of a lecture that I presented at Harvard about 1.5 years ago. Can you see my screen okay?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay. And so what's interesting, and so I'll try and do this in 20 minutes and everyone can start to raise their hands if they get bored or want to cut me off if I run too long. What is interesting about housing as a practice for architects is it was originally a preoccupation with the modern movement of architecture. In the last 20 years or so, it's really lost favor through the kind of commoditization of housing and the kind of rise of the suburbs after the Second World War. So most architects generally are more keen on doing institutional and cultural projects. But it's an important area of work, a practice of any practice. And I would suggest that it's something that has a fundamental impact on the broader economy. So what we did for Harvard is we took Toronto as a case study. What's interesting about Toronto's market is that it is the highest largest residential high-rise market in North America. It's bigger than New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago combined. And so it's quite extraordinary what is really going on in the city. And so what we attempted to try and do as an office is understand why this is happening so that we could better focus our work. So you look at Toronto, this is Toronto in the year 2000. This is a diagram put together by the City of Toronto's Urban Design Department. This is what it came in 2014. You can see a tremendous already intensification of what's going on in the city. And so really, why is that? What is driving the market and what is driving Toronto in particular? It's a project we did a number of years ago. It's called ICE. It's 2 residential towers and an office project we'll come back to. It was a major project when it was finished. It's a total of 1,300 units. And I use that as a kind of a metric. So when we think about back in 2004, there were 32 projects in development in Toronto, equivalent to this. And in 2017, almost 10 or 15 years later, there's a tripling of that activity. So there's an extraordinary amount, obviously, of market activity going on in Toronto. What was also interesting back in 2004 is because condominiums are typically, or market condominiums are typically pre-sold, that is that they're sold prior to construction in order that developers can access construction financing. 2004, there was an unsold inventory of about 25% that represented about 43,000 units in total. Of that, 25% were unsold. In 2017, a few years ago, the unsold inventory was only 7%. That was projects actually under construction. What's interesting about the CMHC just came out recently with an analysis of the housing market in Canada is predicting a great contraction because of factors, sort of demand side factors related to COVID. So far, that's not really showing up. It remains to be seen whether it will or not. So one of the things that sort of, we're all programmed in many ways in our thought process to think about single causal factors. So what is driving the housing market? Is it a bubble? Is it really sustainable? In fact, it is really like many things in life. And if you're ever read Atul Gawande, who writes for the New Yorker magazine in medical malpractice, there are always a series of very different and overlapping factors that really come to bear. And I don't have time to go through them all, but they're kind of four broad categories that really affect what's going on in Toronto and I would say within North America. There's land use policies that are both municipal, federal, and provincial. There are demographic trends, there's economic drivers, and then there's the whole construction market and how it kind of inputs into the system. Starting with the land use policy. So when we think, I'm fond of saying that Toronto, in many ways, is an almost completely intact Victorian city, sort of settled around 1880. And prior to the Second World War, largely tree-lined neighborhoods. You're all familiar with it. You've seen these houses. There's hundreds of thousands of them. After the Second World War, Toronto started a kind of a suburbanization trend that really spread across North America in terms of this idea of kind of a garden city, and where density was tended to congregate around kind of shopping centers and large mixed-use nodes in the form of slab block apartments. That was what we sort of understood post-Second World War housing to be. Now, when you look back at Toronto in 1967, it basically, other than Lake Ontario, had no natural geographic limit to its expansion. It could go east, west, and north, all the way up to to Lake Huron, Georgian Bay. In 1973, which I would argue is one of the bravest provincial government policies, it enacted the Niagara Escarpment Plan, which created essentially a green belt following the escarpment from Niagara Falls all the way up to Tobermory. And this started to kind of delimit the potential western expansion of Toronto. In 2001, the provincial government passed the Oak Ridges Moraine Act, which extended, basically amplified and extended the Niagara Escarpment further east and started to wrap and ring Toronto. And then in 2004, the provincial government brought out the Greenbelt Protection Act, which essentially enhanced and expanded all three areas of the moraine, or the two areas of the moraine and the Niagara Escarpment. So this started to put, in a way, a physical chokehold on Toronto. And as part of that initiative, the Greenbelt, the province designated where municipalities could expand slightly outside their borders, but really looked at already existing developed areas, whether they're small towns or hamlets, or in the case of Toronto, a major city. And then established within major cities what they called urban growth centers. That is where they expect most of the growth in Ontario to occur over the next 25 years. Within the city of Toronto, the largest growth center, and by far the largest in the province, is what we know as the downtown core. And then there is an area in North York along the 401 in East York and York that already were part of the former Metro Toronto that got amalgamated with the City of Toronto. Put another way, if you invert that diagram, over 60% of the City of Toronto is designated and zoned as low-rise residential. So in fact, most of the development is going to occur in downtown Toronto. In 2002, between 2002 and this kind of 15-year period, the single detached houses, the ones that we were very familiar with starting from the Second World War on, dropped by 50%. And in that same time period, high-rise condominiums actually doubled, or quadrupled rather, doubled from 10,000 to 20,000 units per year. So you could see in that time period with the provincial government initiatives and their government planning policy that there was a significant impact on kind of house formation type and development in Toronto. And I could go on and on about all of that kind of government policy. There's a whole municipal piece to that as well. Demographic trends are also really important. Canada, which surprises a lot of people, is the third largest urbanized country in the world, just after Korea and Japan. So we already had a kind of proclivity towards densification. Its population, the population of Canada, a little bit over 20% of Canadians were born abroad. Most of that, and in Toronto rather, over 50, almost now 50% of Toronto was born abroad. So Toronto has twice the amount of sort of immigrant population as a percentage of overall population than the rest of Canada. So it's a very particular place relative to Canada. Prior to 1980, most of the immigration that Canada experienced was largely from Europe. And so a lot of you would expect a lot of the kind of urban development patterns we would have adopted from Western Europe. So it's not surprising. But in the period from the last 15 years, from 2011 to 2016, that immigration pattern has dramatically changed, as is probably self-evident to most people, and largely coming from a different region of the world that I would suggest is much more akin, particularly in dense areas of China and Asia, India, more used to very dense urban settlements. There's also what I call a generational dynamic going on in Toronto. So this is a graph of the percentage of the population within various age groups. The red line is Toronto, the light blue is the rest of Canada. And what you can see is the rest of Canada has a higher percentage of aging baby boom generation, whereas Toronto has a higher percentage of millennial and Gen X. And that's where you expect most of the new housing to be targeted towards in terms of these sort of generational groups. And so if you take a city, another Ontario city like Windsor, you can see that there's basically a hollowing out of the millennial and Gen X group. Presumably there is a kind of intra-provincial migration from smaller cities to larger cities going on in Toronto, which is starting to really drive that dynamic. There's also an intra-provincial migration coming from the rest of Canada. So Toronto in 2004 lost, these are all StatsCan figures, lost an average of 2,000 people a year. 2 years ago, it was gaining around 15,000 a year. So there is also, as I say, a migration from the rest of Canada into Toronto. And this is a fact that I think is absolutely astounding. In 2005, a handful of Americans came into Canada. In 2017, 47,000 came. This is largely, you could speculate, as a result, in part of the immigration policies of the United States and the development of the high-tech sector in Toronto. Within Toronto as well, like all cities, it's divided into a series of wards. The wards on the outlying areas are largely stable in population, whereas the typical downtown ones are exploding. And so if you look at a city center ward on the west side of Toronto, there has been in the last 15 years a 25% expansion in population. There are also major economic drivers. So the residential market, and I think this is particularly attuned to architects, is you ignore this market at your peril. It represents over 7% of the GDP of Canada. This is an enormous amount of economic activity going in Canada relative to similar countries. For example, the US has half that as a contribution to its GDP. So this is a major, major component of our economy. Toronto represents about just under 20% of the population of Canada, but it has what we call agglomeration economics in terms of a far higher percentage of both high income jobs, up to 45% of the rest of Canada, and arts and service sector jobs. And so there again, there is a real concentration of these sectors within the city. During this time, we've also seen, as land supply has curtailed, we've seen a tremendous increase in the cost of single family housing from 2005 to 17. It went from an average of 400,000 to over 1.5 million, or 1.1 million. That number is largely held in the last couple of years. And that has kind of created a tipping point for a shift in the housing market into high-rise residential in terms of affordability. There's also a whole economic piece. I'm sure Larry and others would talk about this in terms of interest rate policy. But what's interesting about this is that in 2016, the government policy started to get worried about high debt loads, created a mortgage stress test to make it more difficult to qualify for mortgages. And what that did is it pushed the market, again, encouraged it from single family housing into high rise. So we're seeing all of these factors kind of coalescing into this high rise market. So in the 15 years, we've seen a 230% increase in the cost per square foot of this, which is really reflective of the amount of activity that's going on in this market. Another major factor is rental housing. And so prior to 1960, Toronto had a very significant amount of rental housing, about 75,000 units. In the decade since 1960, it tripled that amount of housing. And then rent control came in 1979, and there was a market kind of stop in development and construction of rental housing. And whatever advocates of rental housing policy will tell you, it had a really, really significant impact on the production of rental housing, which is necessary for any important and I would say liberal democracy. Whereas when you start to look at condominium construction, which really started in sort of a nascent movement in the early 1970s, you can start to see over the intervening decades a gradual increase in the number of units. That is really in many ways following the decrease in rental housing. So we've really created a kind of a new rental market that is owned by individual tenants as opposed to large landlords, which I think is actually a very interesting phenomenon and very unique to Toronto. And there's a whole issue of vacancy rates. There's very, very little vacancy. This has also had an impact, I would argue, and certainly on the work of John Oxford and other commercial developers on commercial development. So largely in the Toronto's central business district between 64 and 92, there was very, very little, well, its core was largely built up until 1992 with very, very little residential. And from 84 to let's say about 10 years ago, there was virtually no commercial development built in downtown Toronto. Most of it was out in the suburbs, sort of following kind of urban migratory habits of people buying houses out in the suburbs. In the last 10 years, what we've seen is a tremendous concentration of urban development in downtown Toronto, which is very, very unusual for Toronto. We've also seen concentration of residential development. And when you map those two together, you can see there's actually an overlapping period. And so I would argue or suggest that housing development in a way is starting to drive commercial development, which is a fairly obvious point when you start to think about it. And what it's starting to drive are these very, very complex, high-density mixed-use projects. These are just a few that our office has been working on the downtown core, and they're typically combined with retail, office, and residential, and in which residential projects are starting to cross-subsidize the development of office buildings that are by nature difficult to develop with high land prices. And it's introduced this whole idea of what the city calls complete communities, where we're starting to see within large-scale developments, entire communities of schools, daycares, retail, office, and residential, almost like a microcosm of the city. Just a few other projects that we're working on. So enough of that. It's also the whole idea of approvals, and this would be subject to, and you're going to have to confront when you go into practice, municipal approvals, particularly in the city of Toronto, are becoming more and more difficult. This could be an hour and a half lecture on what is going on, but suffice to say that the city of Toronto really has no intact zoning bylaw. If you look up and take any particular property in downtown Toronto, and this is a project we're working on Charles Street and just south of Bloor Street in Toronto. If you look up the zoning bylaw, it says that it has a 2.0 FSI on the site, and yet through a rezoning that our office completed over the last year, it was rezoned to just under 20% FSI, and that is typical all across Toronto. So there really is no zoning bylaw. Everything is negotiated on a site-by-site basis, which causes a whole series of knock-on conditions. George Baird and Barton Myers worked on I would call a seminal work in 1978 called Vacant Lottery, where they advocated for intensification of infill development as opposed to slab block apartment buildings, which is what was really occurring prior to that. So you can think of beautiful neighborhoods like the Annex, where houses were being taken down and small apartment buildings being built, and they were saying, no, there's a way to preserve the existing housing stock and then fill it in. Sort of not this, but this. What really is happening now in Toronto as we move past that, we're combining both of them. So this is a project we did a number of years ago, but where we're actually inserting high density residential neighborhoods, or development rather, into existing fabric, and also in a kind of and this happens to be a culturally mixed use project with a ballet school, as well as housing and so forth. But what the city prefers, and they're not really recognizing and understanding the kind of the dynamic of what is going on socially and demographically in Toronto, is that they prefer what they term, or I would term, a prescriptive standard. In other words, they say, if you wanted to build in Toronto, we're not going to give you a zoning bylaw, but we're going to give you a formula about how to build a building. And which explains why typologically, most of what's going on in downtown Toronto in terms of high-rise residential is both fairly abysmal architecture, and we could do a lot better, but it's also not very typologically diverse because it comes from these very prescriptive high-rise or tall building standards. And that everything is kind of mandated, and then the transitions from tall buildings to lower areas. And what I would advocate for and suggest is that we start with performance standards. So this is an extract from the New York Midtown bylaw, which also mandated restrictions on development, obviously, but started with an idea about a performance standard in terms of the public realm in the city. So it said, look, if you want to densify Midtown Manhattan, that's fine, but what we're going to do is create standards that allow the natural light to occur at all the major intersections within Midtown. So at least it's based on an idea about a contribution to the public realm as opposed to a prescriptive idea about how to build buildings. I'm going to try and just wrap this up. There are many other factors. One of them is constructional efficiencies. There's been a lot of talk recently about timber high-rise construction or prefab high-rise construction, which are both very, I would say, interesting to architects, but Toronto historically has been a concrete town. It can build incredibly efficiently, and we're one of the few jurisdictions in North America that actually fly forms rather than knockdown forms, and that we're now building buildings in which we occupy the base of the building while the upper portion of that building is still being built, which has an enormous impact on the kind of financing and profitability. And I'll just end with all of this is what's missing. Not only we have the prescriptive standards of tall buildings, guidelines in Toronto that really are kind of stultifying architecture, but this whole idea of where else we can be expanding and densifying in Toronto. And the city has an initiative, they call it the Avenue Study, which looks at a series of avenues throughout the city for kind of modest intensification. And as a potential future practitioner, I think you'll be working on a lot of these projects as a kind of an adjunct to what's going on in downtown Toronto. The project we did many years ago, over 20 years ago, as a kind of a mid-rise project, at a time when there were very, very few mid-rise projects under construction, but which really explored typologically the idea of a housing unit, looking at it in terms of creating the sense of amenity as opposed to a very prescriptive pattern of just double-loaded corridor buildings. Increasingly, we have clients that are looking at what I would call these kind of vestigial and industrial sites that are almost like seams that run through the city. A lot of them are former railway corridors. The city is hanging on to these as employment lands. They were originally industrial zone lands, and they think that they need to hold them on as for employment. And what I'd argue is that what they need to do is open them up for development. It'll encourage housing, which will in turn encourage additional employment. So this was just a project we recently completed. another series of projects we're working on. And I'll just end there. I think I've gone over my allotted time, and I'll try and hand this back to the moderator.
Thank you, Peter. We really appreciate, it's quite an effort, sort of condense all of that very important information in a brief amount of time. And I think there's a lot for us to unpack in the discussion afterwards.